Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the Book by Book blog, and I'm here with another part of my 2022 reading wrap-up. This time I'm going to be talking about my own choices for best nonfiction books that I read in 2022. You might also enjoy my wrap-up video. In that, I mentioned that I read a total of 13 nonfiction books in 2022. That's pretty typical for me. I join a nonfiction challenge every year. It's one that's hosted in the blog world. I'll leave the link down below so that you can see all the challenges that I joined last year. And generally, I read mostly fiction. I read 75 books last year. Most were fiction. But I do enjoy some nonfiction mixed in. And I generally read like 12 to 15 nonfiction books a year. So last year with 13 was right there in the middle. So I have chosen my top 7 nonfiction books that I read in 2022. These are not in any particular order. So first of all, way back in February for Black History Month, I listened to Black Boy by Richard Wright on audio. This is a classic. It's also a memoir. So Richard Wright, the author, wrote about his own childhood. My memory's gonna fail me here. I think it began in Mississippi. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Mississippi. He was brought up in a very poor area, lost his father pretty early on, or I think his father just wasn't in the picture. I believe it begins like during the Depression years when he was a little boy, and his mother was a single mother trying to raise 2 young boys. So it's about he and his brother, and it's his coming of age story, but it's also just incredible history about what life was like at that time for a poor Black family in Mississippi. And it runs through to his adult life. Excellent book, wonderful on audio. So definitely recommend Black Boy by Richard Wright. Toward the end of the year, for Nonfiction November, I love this series of history comics. And the one that I read last year was The National Parks, Preserving America's Wild Places by Falin Cook. Now, I love the series. History comics are great. They're generally aimed at middle grade readers, so if you've got some middle graders at home, these are fabulous books. The whole series is great, but this one, I love national parks. We've been to many of them on our vacations. I love the outdoors and nature, as you'll see from the rest of my best nonfiction choices. And this was just a really great book. Really fun, a great way to learn about history. The drawings were vibrant, but also really interesting and informative. I learned a lot. And I'm someone who has visited a lot of national parks. So really enjoyed the national parks history comics. I think all the rest of my top choices were from Nonfiction November. That's when I read most of my nonfiction for the year. Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand made it into my top 7. You've probably heard of this book or seen the movie. Laura Hillenbrand is a favorite author of mine and a personal hero. She has the same immune disorder I have. What she has accomplished in the books that she's written is just, they're not only incredible books, but the fact that she even managed to write them is amazing. She was at her worst as she wrote Seabiscuit. It was before she became famous and earned some money and was able to get some treatments for this disease, for which no official treatments exist, by the way. And she wrote some of Seabiscuit lying on her back in bed with her eyes closed on a notepad with a pencil. Just stunning. The research that she's done is amazing. But, I mean, the best part about Seabiscuit is just that it's such an engaging, interesting story. She is an amazing storyteller. Her other famous book is Unbroken, another great example of her storytelling. To be clear, I have no interest in horse racing. I have no interest in horses or racing or anything that this book is about, and I loved it. It's just a fabulous story, and that is another talent of hers, recognizing these little known stories that are just fascinating and engaging. Now, Seabiscuit was not little known at the time. In the 30s, when he became famous, he was actually, this horse was actually the number one person in the news that year. Not Hitler, not Roosevelt, Seabiscuit. I think that was like 1938. So it's an amazing story. You do not have to be into horse racing to appreciate this incredible story. And it's not only about the horse, but about his jockey and his trainer and his owner, people who became like a family to each other. So wonderful story, highly recommend Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand. I did put the books in alphabetical order, so they're not in the order of what I liked most, just alphabetically. 6 Walks in the Footsteps of Henry David Thoreau by Ben Shattuck. This was a Booktopia selection. If you're familiar with my channel, you've probably heard me mention Booktopia before. It's a wonderful annual event held the first weekend in May in Manchester, Vermont every year at the Northshire Bookstore. So anyway, Ben Shattuck was one of those selected authors this year. So I not only loved his book, I also got to meet him and talk to him about it. It is a memoir, as the subtitle says, of him following in the footsteps of Henry David Thoreau. So he chose 6 walks. Well, technically one of them is a canoe trip, but 6 nature trips that Thoreau wrote about, either in some of his more famous books or in his personal journals. And Ben recreated those walks. So it's about Thoreau and recreating these walks, but it's also a memoir about the author himself and his own experiences. While he was taking these walks and writing this book, he went through a terrible bout of Lyme disease. My son and I both have Lyme disease, in addition to that immune disorder. So I could really relate to that. But it's a beautiful, beautifully written book about nature. Again, you'll see this as a common theme in the books that I loved best. His walks are in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The canoe trip is up in Maine. One walk along the coast of Massachusetts, Rhode Island. So you get everything that's great about a memoir, insight into someone else's life with pieces that you can relate to, but also this beautiful nature writing, and my first introduction to Thoreau, which you will see led to another one of my favorite books last year. So that's 6 Walks in the Footsteps of Henry David Thoreau by Ben Shattuck. This next book was the one that I chose as my #1 nonfiction read of the year. As you might have seen in my wrap-up video, The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. This is an amazing story about an innocent man who was imprisoned on death row for 30 years in Alabama. It is memoir. It is co-written by him with a co-author. He went into prison in his 20s and spent 30 years on death row. So this is not only about, the beginning, of course, is about him being wrongly imprisoned and wrongly found guilty, and the things that went wrong in his case, the things that were intentionally done to find him guilty, even when the evidence didn't match up. It's just stunning. There's no other word for this book. It is stunning. But it's not only about the wrongful imprisonment. It's also about what it's like to live on death row. He is representing here not only his own experiences, but those of some of the other men that he was incarcerated with. Many of them never saw each other. He was in a solitary cell, as were the others on death row, for 30 years. But they got to know each other by talking through the bars. And for his first 3 years, he didn't say a word. He was so terrified, so freaked out about what had happened to him. He didn't say a word. And then he found his voice again, and he reached out to the other prisoners. He actually started a book group for the guys on death row. It is an amazing story. So while parts of it are horrifying, other parts are really beautiful and inspirational. And the way he came through this experience is just amazing. So I highly recommend The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton, a memoir about 30 years on death row for an innocent man. And I want to thank Nikki at Red Dot Reads for telling me about that book. Another of my favorite nonfiction books in 2022 was These Precious Days by Ann Patchett. This is basically memoir. It's a collection of personal essays written by Patchett, who of course is famous as a novelist. I loved listening to this, and it is especially good on audio because she reads it herself. I always love a memoir read by the author. I think that just adds a whole other dimension to it. So in these separate essays, they kind of come together to give you a picture of her whole life. Her childhood, her essay about her childhood and her love of Snoopy and the Peanuts just made me laugh out loud because I was that kid too. She and I are about the same age, so I think I could especially relate to a lot of what she wrote about. She's got an essay called My Three Dads about her biological father and her two stepfathers and what they each meant in her life and the end of each of their lives. Having lost my own dad 7 years ago, I could relate to that as well. But she also writes a lot about her life as a best-selling author, what that's actually like. There's a real fun essay in there about how the different covers for her novels were chosen and which she liked and didn't like. And then the longest essay in the book is also the most moving and emotional. And I don't want to give anything away. It's about her friendship with Tom Hanks' personal assistant. I know that sounds weird, but you have to hear the story from her own mouth and understand what happened and how they really bonded during the pandemic when she was staying with Anne. An amazing story. So this whole collection as a whole, it's got a lot of emotional depth, as you'd expect from her. The writing is beautiful, of course. It made me laugh. It made me tear up. It's warm. Just thoroughly enjoyed the experience of listening to These Precious Days by Ann Patchett. And finally, the last book in my best nonfiction read last year was Walden by Henry David Thoreau. I was inspired to read this by reading Ben Shattuck's memoir, 6 Walks, and I'm very glad I did. Now, if you watched some of my Friday Reads videos while I was reading it, you might be surprised that this came out as one of my favorites. There were things that were sort of annoying about it. Like, it's really a collection of essays. And the first one is like 75 pages long, and it's called Economics. And it's basically Thoreau ranting about how other people live their lives. So you can skip that. You can skip that whole chapter if you like. The rest of the book, which is about nature, which, as I've said, is something very important to me, was just what I had hoped to get out of this book. Beautiful writing, incredibly intimate descriptions of his experiences living on Walden Pond. Such amazing detail of the wildlife and the birds and the changing of the seasons. There were so many passages that I loved and marked that there were too many to recopy into my quotes journal. I don't know if you can see this, but all those dog-eared pages are quotes that I loved. Really beautiful writing. If you love the outdoors, I would say this is a must-read. You can skip that first 75-page chapter if you want. But I definitely enjoyed Walden by Henry David Thoreau. So those were my favorite nonfiction reads of 2022. I would love to hear what you liked best. What was your favorite nonfiction book read last year? Let me know in the comments down below.